Thank you, Camille. Thanks, everyone, for inviting me. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to be here and give this keynote, which is titled The Origins of the Public Domain. So the inspiration for this talk came from last year's European Public Domain Day. So those of you who were here may remember that towards the end of the day, a speaker from the National Library of Wales told us that in Welsh, public domain translates to public property, and that sparked a bit of a discussion around, well, where does the term public domain actually come from? And at the time, I was writing a chapter about the public domain for an encyclopedia, and I thought that sounded interesting, and so I looked into it. And so today's talk is based on the result of that little piece of research I did back then. So what I'll tell you about throughout the talk is about the origins of the public domain as they are discussed by academics in literature, in scholarship. Then I'll tell you a bit about the origins of that scholarship itself, where does that academic literature come from, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the origins of the phrase public domain in law. So when did the public domain appear in copyright law? And I'll do that hopefully to set the scene for the speakers that will present later. But before doing that, I thought also in the spirit of European Public Domain Day, I would start with a few examples of authors and works that entered the public domain a couple of weeks ago in all jurisdictions with a copyright term of life of the author plus 70 years. So one of them is Thomas Mann, and I thought here I would show Dr. Faustus. I thought that was quite topical, as it talks about a music composer who strikes a deal with the devil to get creative genius. But also what I find interesting about it is the picture. So Thomas Mann's works are in the public domain, but is that picture also in the public domain? Well, I would say the underlying work, that's the cover of the first European edition of Dr. Faustus, definitely is from 1947. So even in jurisdictions that protect typographical arrangements, that will be in the public domain by now. The photograph of that cover, I would say yes, in most jurisdictions it is in the public domain as well, definitely in Europe, where we have Article 14, you'll hear more about it later, but basically says that faithful reproduction of out-of-copyright works don't attract copyright. But yet, if you look at the Wikimedia disclaimer, it says that the photograph actually, well, the person who took the photograph claims copyright over it, but then gives permission to everyone to use it under the condition of crediting them as the author. And that's problematic on several levels, but so again, the question is that in the public domain in light of that piece of information? Again, as we will see, I think it depends on how you define the public domain, really. A second example is Albert Einstein, who also entered the public domain. So Einstein's publications are in the public domain, but how about that photograph? Again, the famous photograph of Einstein sticking out his tongue. If you look at Wikimedia, it's in the public domain in the United States because it was published between 1931 and 1977 without a copyright notice. But the photographer died in 1991, so it's still in copyright in jurisdictions like EU jurisdictions, unless they apply the rule of the shorter term. So again, another couple of layers of complexity, the territoriality of the law, which you'll also hear about later, rule of the shorter term. And the third and last example I wanted to give you is Sir Alexander Fleming, who also entered the public domain January this year. So like Einstein, his publications are in the public domain. How about the photograph here? Well, that looks like it's in the public domain worldwide, but it took yet a different route to enter the public domain. So it was, I'm not sure if you can read the disclaimers, hopefully, but I can read it out loud. Basically, it says that it was protected by Crown copyright, which is a UK-specific copyright regime, because it was taken by a UK government official, and the UK government said that once Crown copyright expires, that enters the public domain globally, worldwide. So that seems to be in the public domain in any jurisdiction. But then if you look at the source of the image, that's the Imperial War Museum collections, and if you go to the website of the Imperial War Museum, they say, yes, you can download it and use it for free, but only for non-commercial purposes, whereas if you want to use it for commercial purposes, you have to buy a license. And that's yet another layer of complexity. So is that photograph in the public domain? Again, it depends on how you define it, but I would say from a legal point of view, almost definitely yes. But from a user point of view, it really depends, like whether you end up on Wikimedia Commons, in which case, yes, it's in the public domain, but then if you find it on the Imperial War Museum's website, you may have a different idea. So that's really like the main theme I hope will emerge from my talk. So I talk about the origins of the public domain, but I'll do that with a view to sort of challenging the question, what are we talking about, or rather, what should we be talking about when we talk about the public domain? So as I said, I'll start addressing that question by looking at the origins of the public domain as they're discussed by academics, and I thought that a good way to introduce that is principle number 1 of the Public Domain Manifesto by Communia, which is the public domain is the rule and copyright protection is the exception. And that's not just a very important principle, but it's also a topic that is, extensively debated in academic literature, and is extensively debated because it's relevant in many respects, also for policy making, because if that's true, if the public domain is the rule and copyright is the exception, then if what you're trying to do is to extend copyright protection or duration, then we will have a harder job because you're trying to introduce an exception to the rule, whereas if copyright is the rule and the public domain is the exception, it will be the other way around. And so one way that academics address that question is through an historical lens. And as you can imagine, academics offer different views on where does the public domain come from. So I'll give you just a few highlights here, but for example, Mark Rose argues that copyright and the public domain were born together, and that was part of the long social process that Jürgen Habermas calls the emergence of the public sphere. Other academics like Ronan Deasley challenge that. They say the interdependence between copyright and the public domain actually is true only on a rhetorical level, whereas the actuality of the public domain predates copyright. And other academics agree with Deasley, but in different ways. Some, like Joanna Costello, put an exact date on when the principle of the public domain was established, and according to Costello, it was a decree in Venice in 1517, which revoked all existing privileges from books that were already in print. Others, like Ochoa, are more ambitious and say, well, no, actually the public domain has existed since forever, since time immemorial. So when someone drew that picture of a pig in a cave around 51,000 years ago in Indonesia, they were already drawing from the public domain. The public domain has always existed. They probably had seen something similar in another cave. They copied it or at least got inspired by it. And so it's the natural state of things. But then yet other scholars challenge that. I mean, Jane Ginsburg, for example, quite directly says that those assertions about the immemorial quality of the public domain are anachronistic. Or more recently, Séverine Dussolier, who is with us today, reminded us that in reality, copyright created the public domain. Public domain is as much a legal creature of modernity and a legal fiction as copyright is. So again, that's just to give you a flavor of the kind of debates you find in the literature if you read it. And it's very fascinating literature. I've included all the references, so I would recommend, if you're interested, you can find more there. But then the second sort of set of origins I wanted to address are the origins of that literature itself. So where does that academic literature come from? And that's a bit easier to trace because academic papers have got references. And if you look at those references, you can see that many, if not most, of those papers include references to those two and trace the origins back to two pieces of scholarship from the US. So one is David Lang's Recognizing the Public Domain from 1981, and the other one is Jessica Littman, The Public Domain from 1990. Excuse me. And just, briefly to give you an idea of what they say, I mean, they come from very similar premises. I mean, they're almost 10 years apart, but both Lang and Littman in the 80s and 90s were concerned about overreaching claims that were being made in US courts about copyright, like property equivalent theories and other arguments underpinning, for stronger copyright protection. They both highlight the importance of the public domain from the point of view of creative practice. They both say, you need a robust public domain for authorship and creativity to be viable. But they both note also that despite the importance of the public domain in the copyright system, the public domain receives very little attention. by IP lawyers. So here we are in the 1980s, 1990s. They say, when the few times that IP lawyers talk about the public domain, they do that in a negative way. So they present it as a negative concept, either as what's left over once all IP rights have expired, or as something that is not deserving IP protection, that is not good enough to be protected by copyright. And also, often they use negative language, not just scholars, but as we'll see later, even the law uses the famous fall metaphor, that something falls into the public domain rather than entering or being elevated to the public domain. So they challenge that, and they both call for a more positive, affirmative theory of the public domain. So they say, we need a theory that highlights the importance of the public domain. And then in terms of differences, Lang, while he calls for an affirmative theory and definition of the public domain, he doesn't really offer one. He just says we need one. But he hints at the idea of the public domain as a separate place, something separate from copyright as a sort of a sanctuary that needs to be protected by external threats. Littman, on the other hand, she does develop a theory of the public domain, and in her theory, the public domain is not really separate from copyright. So the premise of Littman's theory is basically a challenge to the romantic view of authorship. So the idea that authors create out of nothing, so in isolation, and that is often used as an argument for stronger copyright protection. Well, what Littman says is, well, that's not true. Creators actually reuse, transform, translate all the time. And in her definition of the public domain, she includes not just out-of-copyright works, which is like the traditional definition, but also elements of copyright-protected works that are not protected by copyright. So, for example, ideas under the ideas expression dichotomy, the fact that you can reuse certain elements of works, even if those works are protected. And just to give you a visual idea of how I understand Littman's definition, if you take Matisse's The Snail, so Matisse, as we celebrated last year, entered the public domain in Europe in 2025. And so his late work was primarily cutouts, like this one, The Snail. And so one way of interpreting what Littman is arguing is that, the public domain includes not only the snail, the work itself, whose copyright has expired, but even when the snail was protected, like the shapes that Matisse used to put it together, as well as the idea of using cutouts to create a work of art, they were in the public domain as well. So you could look at the protected work and borrow those elements. And the theory or the argument of Littman is basically that, so here I gave an example where you can sort of dissect, right, the elements that have been reused from the work, but Littman's argument is that in the vast majority of cases you can't do that. You can't dissect what has been reused from what has been added or transformed, and therefore the public domain becomes really a fundamental part of the copyright system because it enables not just creativity, but also the copyright to be tolerable, to exist, because, well, I really, she does a much better job in articulating her theory, but basically what she's saying is that if you didn't have a robust public domain that protects raw materials and ideas, then every time that someone claims copyright ownership over something, they would have to demonstrate what they added, to separate, and that's impossible, so you need a public domain that supports that legal fiction of originality. Anyway, where I wanted to get at is that after those two papers, what happens is that in the 1990s, copyright gets extended quite dramatically. So both at the international level and at domestic level, copyright gets extended in terms of duration and subject matter that it covers. So the public domain suddenly shrinks. And also I wanted to mention, we don't have time to go into it, but there is really interesting scholarship about the origins of those extensions. There is a very interesting copyright history scholarship that also offers different interpretation of the origins of those extensions. Again, references are there, but basically that's how we got, the term we're working with now, life of the author plus 70 years. But from a scholarly point of view, what that sort of prompted is a reaction. So academics and then practitioners reacted to those expansions, and in scholarship what happens is basically an explosion of literature. So suddenly towards the end of the 1990s and the early 2000s you see a proliferation of papers that respond to Lang's and Littman's call for affirmative theory. So a lot of different academics come up with very sophisticated definitions and theories of the public domain. And just to give you a couple of visual examples, some of these academics also try to visualize the public domain. One example is Pamela Samuelson, who tries to map the public domain, and in her map, the public domain is a separate territory with contiguous terrains, and at the core you have out-of-copyright works, but also elements of protected works that are not protected. So she sort of separates the two domains, the private domain of copyright and the public domain. Whereas others, like Deasley, intersect, so he presents the public domain and the relationship between copyright and the public domain as a Venn diagram where the two domains intersect, and at the intersection you can find ideas as well as uses of protected works under copyright exceptions, which is something I'm personally interested in. And then, again, just to give you an idea of the amount, like the year after Pamela Samuelson, in a lecture she gave, she examined 13 different conceptions of the public domain she could identify in the academic literature, and she even identifies 5 more, and that was just in 2007. So that's just to give you an idea of the many different conceptions and definitions you can find in the literature. And then after 2007, academics have continued to define the public domain in different ways, also to introduce the speakers of the panel later. Here a couple of examples. One is Séverine Dussolier's definition from her extensive study for the World Intellectual Property Organization, and the other one is from the study carried out by CREATE colleagues, including Martin Kretschmer, who is also here, and Christopher Eriksson, who will present online later. So with different ambitions, they offer different definitions of the public domain, and I mean, really here the point I'm trying to make is that if you then look at the definitions, you can see that sometimes it's just a matter of using different words for the same things, so they use different language. Sometimes they refer to similar things but with some differences, whereas in other instances they exclude from their definition certain elements that other academics include in their own definition. And that's very much the nature of research, because with research, especially with empirical research, what you need is a working definition. You need a definition that allows you then to draw some meaningful conclusions. So if what you're doing, for example, is try to to measure the economic value of the public domain, including copyright exceptions, including uses of protected works under exceptions, can become challenging, because exceptions are circumstantial. Some of them only allow non-commercial uses, so you need a more clear-cut definition. And just to wrap up on this, academics have also articulated in different ways this phenomenon of having many different definitions. For example, famously James Boyle said, there is not just one public domain, there are many. All these different definitions means we live in a world with many different public domains. And also to sort of visualize what I'm trying to get at, which again is sort of the guiding question throughout my talk, is what are we talking about, or what should we be talking about when we talk about the public domain? Are we talking about just works like the painting by Matisse on the right-hand side, the famous Harmony in Red, which expired last year? Or are we also talking about Larry Rivers' example here, where the artist appropriated Matisse's work and recreated it with a few changes, also quoting La Danse, another painting by Matisse. So when he did that, that was 1996, so when Matisse was still in copyright. So he was probably doing that under the fair use doctrine, so under copyright exception. So when Larry Rivers was doing that, was he drawing from the public domain or was he doing something else? So that's another question I have for us to think about. And then finally, to move to the statutory origins of the public domain. So where does the phrase public domain come from? Because as I briefly mentioned, academics have discussed where the concept of the public domain come from. And if you believe, for example, that copyright created the public domain, and then you are arguing that with the Statute of Anne, which is the first ever copyright statute from 1710, that's what created the public domain, or some of the court cases that happened afterwards. By basically, the Statute of Anne established that books were protected, printed books were protected for 14 years, After that, as case law later established, books could be reprinted by anyone. So that's the concept. But the phrase public domain was not used back then in 1700s. It appeared, most academics argue, with the Berne Convention. So the first ever international copyright convention in 1886 mentioned the public domain twice, in Article 6 and Article 14, using the fall metaphor in both cases and referring to rights that expire. So once, it applies to works which have not yet fallen into the public domain through copyright expiration. Then while just curious to note that the original text of the Berne Convention is in French, and so that expression falling into the public domain has been also traced to French commentators and poets from like I don't speak French, but like tomber dans le domaine public, so falling into the public domain is an expression that emerged in French commentaries and literature in around the mid-1800s. Then while I was looking into it, I actually found, again, out of curiosity, a reference which is older than the Berne Convention, though the public domain was already mentioned in an Italian Copyright Act in 1875 in relation to sort of performance rights, like representation and execution rights. And how about the public domain today? So it is used not in all jurisdictions, like in the UK, I don't think has ever appeared in UK statutes, the expression public domain. In EU law, it has been used, as I said, like in Italy since 1800s, but at the EU level also from the term directives. The public domain phrase started to appear in 2006 and then in 2011. And then more substantially with the latest copyright directive from 2019, which has a whole article dedicated to the public domain, Article 14, which I mentioned earlier. And in all those instances, they refer to the public domain as works whose copyright protection has expired. Then if you look at the opinions of advocate generals like A.G. Spooner in Pelham, that definition sort of extends to also elements of protected works which clearly remain in the public domain, like words taken in isolation or common expressions. But again, I mean, what I'm trying to do here is not really to try to extract any sort of meaning or binding meaning from the legal text, not at all, quite the opposite. The point I'm trying to make is that really the public domain is used in the law, but as a descriptive notion rather than a normative one. So we're not bound by any sort of legal concept, and that's what gives us freedom, that definitional freedom I tried to explain earlier. We can define the public domain as we want, and at least in my view, that's a good thing. Others argue, that may create confusion, but I think that is potentially a good thing. But yeah, I'll get back to that. The last reference to the public domain in EU law I wanted to mention is actually, and probably my favorite reference to it, is not from copyright law actually, but it's from the Open Data Directive. So if you look at the Open Data Directive, recital 49, which talks about public and private partnerships in digitization, basically says that when a cultural institution digitize something in partnership with a private company, then some form of exclusivity is allowed over the digitized item to allow the private partner to recoup its investment. But in establishing that, it also says that that period should, however, be limited to as short a time as possible in order to comply with the principle that public domain material should stay in the public domain once it is digitized. And I like that, for several reasons. First, because it sort of elevates that to the principle status, is not in copyright law, is in sort of public law, administrative law, Open Data Directive. So again, a sort of overarching principle, which is not specific to the public domain. And also because I think it speaks to the success of the advocacy work that many people in this room have been doing in the last few years, because it also reminds you of the language you can find both in the Public Domain Manifesto by Comunia and in the European Public Domain Charter, which was revised and launched at the European Public Domain last year. They both say what is in the public domain must remain in the public domain, or that the public domain is permanent, and yeah, again, what's in the public domain needs to remain in the public domain. Anyway, so I took you through this sort of historical journey, but again, what I was not trying to do is to argue that whatever conception of the public domain we develop needs to be consistent with its historical origins. I mean, looking at history, I think is incredibly important and can be incredibly meaningful. We can learn a lot of lessons. But I don't think that the conception, the definition of the public domain we should work with needs to, the main test should be whether it's consistent with its historical origin. In fact, on that point, I agree with Julie Cohen, another academic, who said in a paper from 2006 that actually the ultimate test is not historical fidelity, but whether the public domain model fits the phenomenon it is intended to represent. So Cohen says that the public domain is a policy construct, and her point of view, like Lang and Littman's, is that the public domain is important for the development of artistic culture. So from that point of view, it needs to be measured against the ways that creative practice works. But also it's important to note that that's just one view on the importance of the public domain. The public domain is really important for creative practice, but is also very important for democracy, is very important for the economy, is very important for research, for education, and all sorts of purposes. And what I think Cohen is trying to say here is that depending on and what also James Boyle tried to capture with the many public domain articulation is that, the public domain definition really depends on what you're trying to achieve with it. What are you trying to support creative culture? Are you trying to support research? Then you should define the public domain accordingly. And that's really from that I extract two questions for everyone in this room, really, not just for the advocates in the room, for the academics in the room, the practitioners, the policymakers. And my questions are, what model of the public domain should we develop and support? And related to that, what should be the focus of public domain advocacy? And I don't expect an exact answer to those questions. Rather, I believe that, the talks and discussions that will come today and events like this really contribute to a collective answer that is continuously evolving. That's why I believe I like the flexibility of the public domain, the definitional freedom we all enjoy, and I believe events like this one contribute to that meaningful and evolving conception. And to conclude, not with a textual slide, but with another nice image that entered the public domain, and also with a tribute to another artist who just entered the public domain. And also a little call to action, which is also a tribute to the amazing work that this community, and many people in this room have been doing and keep doing to make the public domain a reality. I just wanted to show this. Fernand Léger entered the public domain January this year, but a few of his paintings are on Wikimedia Commons, but waiting for being tagged as public domain in countries with a copyright term of life of the author plus 70 years. So that's my tribute and call to action to the Wikipedias in the room. If you want to log in and tag it, you can do that. It's in the public domain now. And so thanks so much in advance to whoever is going to do that. And thanks very much, everyone, for listening. Thank you.